Welcome to the Clear Gun Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. I hope the middle of everyone's week is going quite all right. We've got a lot of news to cover with you guys today. So first, we're going to start off with a strike against our channel from YouTube. I'll tell you guys a little bit more about that. Then we're going to go right into the news. We'll go to a juxtaposition between Biden and Fauci and how the federal government might not have the answer, which we already knew, but now they admit it, to COVID, that is. Then we'll talk about cloth masks once more. WebMD is catching up with all of us. We'll talk about Blasio in New York and the mandate that's rolling out today, or yesterday that is. Then we'll talk about a Fauci groupie. So this is kind of a weird phenomenon that we see in the news every now and then, and here's another one that popped up just the other day. We'll talk about the WHO has a new vaccination goal for COVID-19. There's going to be new COVID records in terms of caseloads across the world. We'll go over those briefly. We'll talk about how the CDC is talking about not using a PCR test to ensure that you're done with your COVID, isolation situation. So that's interesting. And finally, we're going to go over 2 Omicron papers, and we'll do it very briefly. So let's dive on in. Well, one thing, it finally happened. We got our first community guidelines strike. So what's interesting about this is they do not tell me anywhere in the strike documentation what part of the video actually constituted the strike. So there's an appeal process, and I'm doing the appeal right now. I'm going to show you guys the silent version of the video that I think is what got me flagged. And it's basically a video of Rachel Maddow talking about how if you get the vaccine, you will not transmit coronavirus. And that's inaccurate, and we discussed why that was inaccurate on the episode. But YouTube flagged that particular section, I think, for misinformation because it follows in their guidelines that you can't talk about how the vaccine works 100% of the time. So I appealed to YouTube and I said, hey, I actually discussed why this is wrong. But for now, the video is down from the channel. I'm planning on putting it up on Rumble and doing a Rumble account. I'll keep you guys posted on the situation and how it's unfolding. And once it's up on Rumble, I'll send everybody a link. So that's why there was no Monday episode. It exists. It's just been pulled off of my channel. But now on to the news. Let's hear what Biden has to say about the federal government's response to COVID.
Look, there is no federal solution. This gets solved at a state level.
Of course, this is an obviously true statement, especially with a disease such as Omicron, which is airborne and highly transmissible. But if we go back not too long ago to August 3rd, look at this headline from ABC News. Biden says help or, quote, get out of the way to the GOP governors on combating the pandemic. Remember, he gave a lot of flack to governors like Ron DeSantis about not going with Biden in terms of a full federal response. And now, just yesterday, well, I guess there is no federal response good enough to tackle COVID. And places like Fox News have jumped on there, and they put articles like this, December 27th, saying Biden says he agrees with GOP governors that there's no federal solution to the pandemic. Now, who hasn't got wind of this is Fauci. Let's see what he has to say about air travel and vaccination for domestic travel.
Let me ask you about something else from the president's interview with David. David asked about the lack of a vaccine requirement for air travel. There is no vaccine requirement for domestic air travel in the United States. And when the president was asked, should there be one, he said that his team has said it's not necessary at this point. Do you agree with that there shouldn't be a vaccine requirement for domestic air travel?
Well, it depends on what you want to use it for. I mean, vaccine requirements for people coming in from other countries is to prevent newly infected people from getting into the country. A vaccine requirement for a person getting on the plane is just another level of getting people to have a mechanism that would spur them to get vaccinated. Namely, you can't get on a plane unless you're vaccinated, which is just another one of the ways of getting requirements, whatever that might be. So, I mean, anything that could get people more vaccinated would be welcome.
So anything that could get people more vaccinated would be welcome, including mandating vaccination for domestic air travel. Now, keep in mind, I don't think we've ever had a mandate for any disease for air travel domestically. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure we haven't. And so this would be a whole new ballgame. But again, Fauci is trying to use the federal government to, basically force people to get vaccination as an end to the COVID pandemic. Biden just said there is no federal solution. So they're going to have to get their story straight. I think Fauci's going to have to go Biden's way. And I think that whole thing is going to it basically makes my Monday episode obsolete, because I talked about how the courts were supporting Biden's OSHA mandates. But now if there's no federal solution, well, what's Biden going to do with all these mandates? I hope end them. Of course, leaving it to the states is the ideal solution. And the problem with that is if you're in the wrong state, well, it's going to be a really sucky time for you, especially states like New York. Let's hear what Mayor Bill de Blasio has to say about the vaccine mandate that took effect on December 27th.
One thing we can all agree, and I've talked to a lot of business leaders about this, COVID is bad for humans, it's bad for our health, but it's also bad for business. And if we want to avoid shutdowns, and I believe we must, we need more and more people vaccinated. So today, the mandate goes into effect for the entire private sector in New York City, all employers. This is how we get people vaccinated. And we've been engaging business leaders, a lot of questions and concerns, which we're working with them on, but also a lot of recognition that this works. And my job is to protect people. So I am 110% convinced this was the right thing to do, it remains the right thing to do, particularly with the ferocity of Omicron. And I don't know if there's going to be another variant behind it, but I do know our best defense is to get everyone vaccinated, and mandates have worked. So
the petty tyrants will have their way. I can see a world where Fauci starts latching on to several state leaders that perform like Bill de Blasio. That's a potential thing that could happen in the near future. Again, Bill de Blasio doesn't say what ends the pandemic. He just says we need to get everyone vaccinated. And of course, obviously a way to get people vaccinated is to force them. That you will increase compliance by forcing. Sure. Is that a viable solution to ending the pandemic? Well, it depends what his criteria are. He never lists them. So that's the usual. We couldn't expect it. But let's see what some people are saying on the science of COVID in terms of masks, in terms of how to stay healthy. First, we'll go to Leanna Nguyen once again on CNN.
Cloth masks are not appropriate for this pandemic. It's not appropriate for Omicron. It was not appropriate for Delta, Alpha, or any of the previous variants either, because we're dealing with something that's airborne. Again,
I'm glad she's on board with what we've been saying for a very long time now. But let's go back to August 16th and see what she was saying to school children wearing masks.
Why wouldn't we want every single tool at our disposal to help to keep our children safe at this point? I mean, we wouldn't imagine bringing together 20, 30 unvaccinated adults, putting them in a single room together the entire day and have them not wear masks. Why would we say that that's okay for our children?
This is just one example, but again, she doesn't specify the kind of masks, and nobody was specifying the kind of masks, from the CDC to Dr. Leanna Nguyen to any of these clowns on the news networks. Nobody was specifying the kind of masks that actually did work. Only now, only within the last couple of days have people been saying, well, those cloth masks, obviously we knew for forever that those don't do anything. Well, no, because everybody for the longest time was saying, everyone wear a mask no matter what, just cover up your mouth, just cover it with whatever you can. We don't want to see those smiling faces. Cover it with bandanas, with cloth masks, with K95s, whatever you can find to cover your mask. That's what they told us. And now, again, like so many other things, the narrative is unraveling right before our very eyes. Now, as the narrative is crumbling, we're going to see a lot of videos come out kind of like this, where people are in a state of confusion and of sort of shock, because for the last 2 years, they've been relying on Fauci to get out of this. They've been relying on people, on supposed experts and different superiors to get them out of this position. And now when it comes out that the emperor has no clothes, they're lost. So let's see what this lady has to say, this alleged Fauci groupie.
Yeah, I mean, Jason, you see how difficult this is for this administration. I mean, I'm a Fauci groupie. I'm a thrice vaccinated mask adherent. I buy KN95 masks by the, caseload. They're in every pocket. I wear them everywhere except when I sit down. And I am certain that this is not a variant I can outrun. And I wonder where you think the sort of conversation is heading at this moment, Jason.
I've done everything you've said. I'm a morally righteous person. I've gotten triple vaccinated. I wear these masks all the time. I buy them by the caseload. I've done everything you said, and I'm scared about this variant. It's going to outrun all the recommendations you've been making. So what happens? What do I do? All the recommendations that you've been telling me aren't going to work for this. It's amazing watching people sort of open their eyes to the fact that there's a critical thinking aspect that's been lost in this response in a lot of the population. And we'll see what happens. I think we're going to see a lot of resistance at first, sort of, hey, we need to keep doing this to prevent COVID from getting much, much worse. When the fact of the matter is, a lot of these policies haven't done anything to mitigate COVID. They really haven't. Vaccines, they were effective. The vaccines were effective in preventing hospitalization, especially early on with the Alpha variants and the Delta variants. But, as Omicron and new variants emerge that have significant mutations, we're going to see a wane in the effectiveness of the vaccine, especially the one created for the Alpha variants. And so people are going to have to face this fact, and it's going to be interesting watching the public open their eyes to this new reality, which has in fact always been the reality, only it's new to them after sort of the leadership's way of presenting COVID. It appears like WebMD is also joining the reasonable discussion side with a recent tweet that said this: sunlight may energize special cells in your immune system called T cells that help fight infection, but being outside brings other benefits too. So for the past several months, maybe a year now, all we've heard is vaccine or die, vaccine or nothing else. But the reality is there's a lot of ways to stay healthy, and very few people have been talking about it. There's exercise, there's sunlight, there's eating right. There's so many things that can help you mount a very good immune response, and it's not just the vaccine. Now, WebMD actually they're reposting an article they posted March 20th, but they've been totally silent, it seems like, on these other fronts for boosting immunity versus just the vaccine. So let's go to the article and just look at a few of them. The link is in the description so you guys can see all the article, but we'll go over just a few. So number one, lack of sleep. Lack of sleep can cause your immune system to be suppressed a little bit, so get good sleep. All right. Here's another one, low vitamin D. It's really good to have vitamin D to fight infection. They also use it, for strong bones and for healthy blood cells. There's another part that we're going to talk about right after this, which is because it's vitamin D from the sun, so you can get it from both your diet and from walking outside. So here's that image, and sunlight can help certain cells produce vitamin D, which also helps increase your immune response. And for the last example, get your exercise. Regular aerobic exercise appears to help the body fight illness caused by viruses and bacteria. I mean, who would have thought? These were all common sense things that people were talking about for a long time. Then all of a sudden COVID hits. It's been nothing but vaccines. These other measures will help vastly improve your immune response to a whole bunch of things, not just corona. So again, welcome back, WebMD, to Reasonable Conversations. Speaking of people with narratives and spinning things only one way, let's take a look at the WHO director once again talking about their new goal for vaccination, for global vaccination rates.
To vaccinate 70% by the middle of 2022. We have 185 days to the finish line of achieving 70% by the start of July 2022. And the clock starts now.
I'm not sure why they're pushing an old vaccine for so many variants into this thing. I don't know why they're pushing an old vaccine, especially by the summer of 2022. This vaccine is not the same as smallpox, for example. It's not the same as rubella. The strategy has to be different, and they're not showing adaptation to this situation. So around the world, we've been seeing a huge spike and huge records being broken for cases of COVID-19 in various countries. Let's take a look at some of those. Here's a look at the latest cases in the UK. This is by cases per million people. Huge spike towards the end of the year here, higher than anything we've seen the entire COVID time. We're seeing the same thing in France, a huge spike, again, more than we've seen in the entirety of COVID. Here in the US, we set our own personal record for COVID cases on December 28th, yesterday. On December 28th, we had 380,751 new cases. The last peak we had that was close to this number was January 8th of 2021, and that was 300,777 new cases that day. So in our last story, before we get to the two papers, the CDC is not going to require testing at the end of isolation, according to Director Walensky. So this is from ABC. The newly updated CDC guidelines don't require testing at the end of isolation because PCR tests can stay positive for up to 12 weeks, said the director to Good Morning America on Wednesday. Quoting the director now, so we would have people in isolation for a very long time if we were relying on PCRs, end quote. Let's take a listen to a tired-looking CDC director explain why, and this is a very fair question, why we should be looking towards the new rapid tests when the FDA just announced that the rapid test might not be as good at detecting Omicron.
Dr. Walensky, good morning. It's always good to have you. I want to start with that concerning announcement from the FDA that those rapid antigen tests may not be as sensitive at detecting the Omicron variant. The Biden administration is about to send out 500 million of these tests. Can they still be trusted?
Good morning, Whit. Thanks for having me. Yes, absolutely. So we do know that the most sensitive test that you can do is a PCR test. So if you have symptoms and you have a negative antigen test, then we do ask you to go and get a PCR to make sure that those symptoms are not attributable to COVID. But those antigen tests still work quite well, and they work well, especially in places that we're using like in higher education, in tests to stay in schools where we're doing several tests, one every other day, every third day, and that's really when they work well as well. So we still are encouraging their use. They may not work as well.
Again, the narrative keeps unwinding, and so we're gonna follow this closely like we have been for the past several months, and we'll keep you guys posted on all things that leadership is saying versus reality and what's happening, and if they're matching up or if they aren't. But now let's go on to some papers. So first we'll break down a paper from Nature that was recently published, and the title is Broadly Neutralizing Antibodies Overcome SARS-CoV-2 Omicron Antigenic Shifts. So the first thing they note, and I'm going to highlight it right here, is that the Omicron variant is substantially mutated compared to any previously described SARS-CoV-2 isolates, including 37 S residue substitutions in the predominant haplotype. 15 of the Omicron mutations are clustered on the RBD, which is the receptor binding domain, which is the main target of neutralizing antibodies after infection or vaccination. This suggests that Omicron might be able to escape infection and vaccine-elicited antibodies and therapeutic monoclonal antibodies. The paper also notes that preliminary reports indicated that the neutralizing activity of plasma from people with the Pfizer vaccine is reduced against Omicron. So the researchers, in order to investigate the magnitude of immune evasion mediated by the 37 mutations presented in Omicron S, they used the Wuhan 1S and the Omicron S pseudoviruses and compared the plasma neutralizing activity in different cohorts of convalescent patients or individuals vaccinated with one of the 6 major COVID-19 vaccines. So basically what they're doing here is they're taking the blood of people who have either been vaccinated or have had previous infection, and they're putting it in a little petri dish, basically. It's not that simple, but basically a petri dish. And then they're going to put these pseudoviruses in there, and they're going to see if the blood from the people who have had infection or who are vaccinated can start mounting response in antibodies to the COVID threat. So here's the good news. Their data further indicates that multiple exposures to the ancestral virus through infection or vaccination results in the production of antibodies that can neutralize divergent viruses, such as Omicron or even SARS-CoV, as a consequence of affinity, maturation, or epitope masking by human or by immune-dominant RBM antibodies. So basically, previous infection and vaccination shows that it gives the body a good ability to mount some kind of response even to Omicron, which is a new strain. This paper also discusses monoclonal antibody treatments, and one thing they note is that sotrovimab, which is one of the treatments being used, does not block ACE2 binding, but rather it neutralizes SARS-CoV-2 by targeting non-RBM epitopes, which are shared across many of the SARS-CoV-viruses, including SARS-CoV. So basically what that means is this second class of monoclonal antibodies actually works by targeting a more conserved trait of coronaviruses, so it can be used broadly against many types of coronavirus regardless of the S protein. The results for the monoclonal antibodies are as follows. Although sotrovimab had a 3-fold reduced potency against Omicron, the Omicron variant, all other RBM-specific monoclonal antibodies completely lost their neutralizing activity, with the exception of the combination of a couple of them. This is really interesting news, and according to this paper, the 3-fold and less than 2-fold decrease in the neutralizing activity of sotrovimab against pseudoviruses and authentic viruses, respectively, is within the currently defined threshold of no change, as defined by the FDA. So that's really good news. That means that, according to this paper at least, sotrovimab works pretty well against many strains, including Omicron. The paper concludes with several of these monoclonal antibodies cross-react with and neutralize SARS-CoV viruses beyond the SARS-CoV-2 clade, indicating that targeting of conserved epitopes can lead to neutralization, breadth, and resilience to antigenic shift associated with viral evolution. So basically, if we can target more conserved traits, our monoclonal antibody treatment could be used across many variations or many strains of viruses regardless of the superficial evolution in the spike proteins, for example. So dovetailing with that paper, I'm going to briefly go over this new paper out of South Africa. The title of the paper is Omicron Infection Enhances Neutralizing Immunity Against the Delta Variant. So the purpose of this paper was to find out whether or not if you get infected with Omicron, will that infection give you immunity or an immune response to a previous version of coronavirus, namely Delta. And what they found in this coming out of the abstract is that neutralization of Omicron increased 14-fold over this time, the infection time, showing a developing antibody response to the variant. Importantly, there was an enhancement of Delta virus neutralization, which increased 4.4-fold. Now here's that statement from the results section. We measured neutralization at the enrollment and the later visit and observed that Omicron neutralization increased from a low geometric mean of 20 to 285, which is a 4.4-fold increase. Importantly, neutralization of Delta increased during this period 4.4-fold. So here are the charts that describe what they were just saying. Of course, we're going to need to replicate this study, and we're going to need to do many more studies to figure out what's really going on. But this is really promising because now it's showing that if you get infected with the much less pathogenic and much less intense version of coronavirus, namely Omicron, it will offer protection against some of the more dangerous versions of COVID like Delta. And with that, we're going to wrap up our episode. And by the way, that's our last episode for the year because Friday's New Year's, so there's not going to be a show then, and we'll be back on Monday. But I want to thank you guys so much for listening to this content. It's been a great year. I've learned so much with you guys. If you liked it, remember, please share with your friends. Let's have them subscribe. Let's get more reasonable content out there and more conversation out there. I look forward to unraveling this COVID narrative with you guys in the next year. And please enjoy this video. See you again on Monday.
Okay, guys, don't get lost.
Oh my God. Wait. Mish. Okay. She's stuck. Look at she's digging. Look.